Afternoon, everyone. So my name is Sen Consulting, and I'm here with the invitation of Full Bay. How many run a for-hire repair shop? How many run a fleet repair shop? Only a few. Okay. Well, I'm going to try to hit on both. Hopefully get some information that's relevant for both topics. So again, my name is Peter Consulting. I work in shops, whether it be fleet or for hire, to help optimize systems and operations and try to win through efficiency. So one of the big things we find in this industry is a lot of shop owners, they're running their shop by gut. They've done this for years. They're experts in the industry. They've got a toolbox full of tools, but unfortunately they don't always have a toolbox full of business ideas. And so that's what I do, is I work with shops to help get them to understand how to run the business. Because so many places, you know, you can go to, they've gone to school to work on trucks or to maintain trucks, but they don't really have any help in the industry trying to understand how to run the business. And there's a lot of industries out there that will focus on automotive and not very many that focus on heavy duty or equipment repair. And as you guys probably know, it's a little different working on a semi than it is working on a car. So what this whole presentation about is trying to make sure you manage your business with numbers and not with gut feeling. Because so many people think they understand what's going on. They, for the most part, they do. But unfortunately, as technology changes and as it becomes even more competitive with the way the markets move, trying to maximize what you have is what's so important. So the 5 data points that we can use to analyze almost any shop, and relevantly almost any business, are 5. So gross sales, that's your total sales dollars. And then the rest of this is going to be a percentage of that. So cost of direct labor with parts person. So that's going to be your mechanics and your parts person. Your service advisors, which are going to be your salespeople. Now, if it's a smaller shop and say the owner or another person has a dual role, like parts and service advisor, you can take this number, you can split it, whichever percentage you want to say that they're doing that job duty, and it'll help with that. Cost of parts, that's just how much money you're spending on parts. And then operating overhead is everything else. It's your lights, it's your utilities, it's your mortgage payment, it's insurance, it's any other thing that doesn't fall into another category. So gross sales dollars, pretty straightforward. It's just what you're selling. So this is a chart, and you can actually take a picture of this if you want. This is just, we're using round numbers here to try to get you to understand what these numbers mean and how they relate. So in this example, we're using a shop that did $100,000 in sales in a month. So if you're trying to make money, which I'm hoping everybody here, who here is running a nonprofit business? Anybody? All right. So everybody's here to try to make money, right? I used to have a saying in my business. My name is Peter. Peter gets paid. I was very upfront, very honest with my employees about numbers. I would just make sure they understood that Peter's here to get paid. And it worked out pretty good for us. So in this example, we did $100,000 in sales. Our cost of labor with parts person was 15%. Our goal is 17%. Now these are pretty close numbers. Like if you hit these numbers, your shop's going to make money. And this will work for a fleet shop too. Cost of service advisors were 6%. The cost of parts. So we've been under on the other two, but cost of parts. So what's that mean, cost of parts? That means your cost versus what you sold it for. So we're looking at profit, gross profit here. And they're over on it. And you can see how much that hurt the bottom line. You know, that's letting a little bit slip. That's giving a guy a deal on a turbo because, you know, it's a big job, it's a $6,000 job, I got to give him a little bit of a break. Well, those breaks are coming out of the owner's pocket. I mean, it directly hits the bottom line. And if you look at this, just that little wiggle cost you $8,000 in profits in 1 month, just being 10% over on parts. And we're going to go into a little bit deeper how you break this down. So cost of direct labor with parts person. This is probably the single biggest area that people have no idea what they're spending. They don't know what their efficiencies are. They don't know what the production is. They just have no idea what's really going on. And part of that is you have to have a way to measure the numbers. If you have no way to measure numbers, you can't know. But the other thing I tell owners is if you don't know what good is and you don't know what bad is, how do you know what you have? So if you haven't told your employees that, hey, we expect, if we're going to pay you 40 hours of work, we expect X number of hours of labor out of you, out of production, then nobody knows what to expect. So here's an example of an average shop. So your average shop in America that I've dealt with runs about 50% efficient. So in this example, you've got 10 technicians. They're working 40 hours a week, which is not normal, right? The average shop in America, the average technician is working 45 hours a week. But in this example, I'm trying to use round numbers. So we got a tech that's working 10 techs, 40 hours a week, 50% efficiency. You're only billing 200 hours in the shop, okay? But look at how much it changes if you can get your guys to run at 100% efficient. Now keep in mind, you don't have one extra penny in expenses. You're paying the guys 40 hours a week, right? You're not paying them 1 cent more. But you're almost doubling your revenue. And that's the key to success in shops. It's through efficiency. Because you have to understand, when you're running a shop, you do the same thing the guy down the street does, right? If you're an independent shop, you do the same thing Kenworth does, the same thing Peterbilt does, right? You're fixing trucks. What makes it different is how you do it. It's how you treat your customers. It's how you treat your employees. It's how you monitor your numbers. And you got to understand, in this world, it's you against them, meaning it's the little guy against the dealer. And I guarantee you the dealership networks, they know everything about every number of everything that happens in that space. These are multi-billion-dollar companies. They know everything. And that's how they win, is they win by monitoring numbers and watching what's really going on. So like I said, you can see from this example, you're almost doubling revenue, not another increase in cost. Now here's another big thing in fleets. I've been doing this for 25 years. I have never been able to get a shop owner to put pen to paper and show me the math that paying overtime makes you money. And they'll always come up and say, oh, but I'm getting so much done. Just think about it this way. If the cost of fuel increased by 50%, would you charge more to run your service truck? Then why don't you charge more for labor when you're increasing your labor costs by 50%? Because that's what you're doing every time you run overtime, right? So here's an example of that, right? If we're paying a guy 20 bucks an hour and he bills 40 hours, you look at the end of the week or the end of this time period, and it's 16% of gross sales, right? We're under that 17% that we were hitting. But what if I just pay a little bit of overtime? Got to get that job done, right? I got a really good customer. He called me up on Friday afternoon. He begged me to get that water pump done, right? So he could get home for the weekend. Well, how much does that cost you? And see, it's cost you 3% of net, which is a substantial amount of money when you add this up at the end of the year. And like I said, the average technician in America is working 45 hours a week, so they're putting in 5 hours of overtime. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions on that? So cost of service advisors. These are the people that are answering the phones. These are the people that should be forward-facing, and they should be focused on sales. If any of you have a service advisor in your shop, even if that's yourself as an owner, you need to make sure that the number one priority is sales, right? You don't want people that are order takers at McDonald's. But everybody knows the phrase, do you want fries with that? Right? That phrase is there to try to sell more. That's what that's about. It's about upselling. So what are the key objectives of a service advisor, right? The number one objective needs to be sales. The other one is, for a lot of shops, this is the way I recommend it when I do consulting for shops, is that person should have their pulse on the workflow of the shop. And why does that matter? They're the ones making the promise to the customer it'll be done on Friday, right? When you have someone on the phone that's giving promises and other people don't know it, it becomes a huge bottleneck in your operation. And this goes in a lot to how do you manage customer expectations. And one of the ways that you do that is clear communication. So if you have some kind of shop management software that you can communicate internally with the customer directly, that really aids in that, slows that down, or speeds up that process, and you're not slowed down by being on the phone all the time. Another way to look at it is an air traffic controller. They're pushing 10 through the shop. Another thing that you really need to focus on doing with service advisors is having them follow up with declined repairs. So if you got a customer that came in that was 50% on brakes, and you know that the way that fleet works, you might want to call them in a month or two and say, hey, do you want to get that in for a brake job? And of course, their objective is to fill the bays. You want them filling the bays. So one of the things, for example, in sales that I always try to teach people is you need to learn to get your service advisors to say yes on your terms. And here's an example of that. You get a phone call on Friday afternoon, everybody's gotten one of these, it's 3 o'clock, I got to get my truck in, it's got to check engine light. I just got to get it in, got to get it in. And you're full, there's no way to do it. And of course, every shop in town is going to say, no, we can't do it, we'll do it on Monday. But what if you're the only shop in town that when that customer calls, says, I have to have it in, I got to have it done, say, absolutely, we can do it on Monday. Oh, I got to have it done on Friday, I got to get it done today. Absolutely. How's 9 a.m. Monday for you work? Now, I know that sounds really dumb, but think about it. That guy's going to hang up the phone because he just wants it done on Friday. But Saturday morning, he's going to wake up after he spent all day Friday trying to call somebody. He's going to say, you know what? Only one guy said yes. And who is he going to call on Monday morning? He's going to call the one guy that said yes. So one thing you really need to teach your employees is stop saying no. Learn to say yes on your terms, right? Cost of parts. This is probably one of the biggest areas that's ignored in repair shops. So unless your shop is selling parts across the counter and that's a major profit center, not saying you sell a couple brake chambers to the farmer down the street, I'm saying that's a major part of your business. Most guys don't understand that that's half of their total business. So in most shops in this country, for every $100 in labor, you're selling $100 in parts, right? That's probably pretty close for most. It's a little off if you're doing a lot of parts sales, but it's pretty close. And it's the single biggest thing that's ignored. People aren't watching their numbers. And I go into a lot of stores and they'll say, well, we're getting, our markup on parts is this. I said, that's great. That's what's in your shop management software. I want to see what you're receiving, how much you paid last month in parts. Show me all the checks you wrote. And you'll find really quick that the management software, shop management software, is not matching your QuickBooks or your accounting software. Does anybody have any idea why the two don't match? Can anybody give an example of why those two numbers are off? The biggest one you don't want to talk about is theft. How many tires are rolling out the back door and going in Bob's trunk and he sells them to the trucker down the street? That's an example. It's theft. Another big one is how many times are you receiving parts that are not getting billed out on the truck? Now, I know every shop has done this. There's always a gasket, an O-ring, something, a seal, right, that you bought, you received it, you paid for it, and it got on the truck. So essentially what you're doing when you have that happen is you're paying to fix someone else's truck. And another big thing to talk about is markup versus margin. So this is a commonly misunderstood in this industry. So markup is essentially your multiplier. I'm going to take it times X, right? Margin is your profit. Now there's a lot of strategies here. A lot of places are just going to charge a flat, I hear this a lot, 25%. I'm going to mark it up 25%, right? Well, who here marks up a $40,000 engine 25%? So if you really get honest, you're not marking everything up 25%, right? You're negotiating some of this other stuff. So markup's used for selling the selling price on parts. You're going to add it to base. It's a cost multiplier. And then margin is what you use to calculate gross profit, and it's a percentage of sales, percentage of selling price. I care more about margin than markup because markup is what you teach your employees to use to get to the right price to sell. Margin is what you should care about as owners because that's what's going in the bank. And here's an example of a parts matrix. This is probably one of the single most underutilized things with private shops is a matrix. An example of this is, if you look at what Cummins is doing lately, there's just been this trend with a lot of OEMs. They're not trying to make a lot of money on the $900 air compressor or fuel pump. What they're going to do is they're going to charge you $25 for a mounting O-ring. Because who's going to buy an air compressor and not buy the O-ring? Right? Do your customers know how much an air conditioning O-ring costs when you have to open up the system and you put all those little green O-rings in? Do you think your customers have a clue what those things cost? I mean, you're buying them in a 10 at a time in a 10-pack, right? They cost you about 5 cents a piece. Do you think your customer will pay $5 for that O-ring? They will, and they won't question it. So you really need to use a matrix. You know, if you look at this as an example, and I know a lot of people are going to say, that's exorbitant. Is it? I mean, it's really, if you're in the business of making money, you got to start figuring out what the market will bear. And so in this example, and this happens a lot, you know, they mark up little stuff a lot, and the big stuff you mark up a little. So one of the ways to win is to have different parts classes, okay? So if you have a good shop management software, you can put your parts into different classes, and you can use a different matrix for each class. So here's an example. Most truck drivers, most owners, they know what a battery costs, right? They know what a starter costs. But like in that example, they don't know what an O-ring costs. They may not know what an engine ECM costs. And another thing is, too, is you can have separate matrix for aftermarkets. You're generally not going to be able to mark up an OEM part the same as an aftermarket. But the example I always trained with was, if you go to Freightliner and buy a OEM Freightliner for a Cascade, it's about $2,200 to $2,400, right? But you can go buy an aftermarket one, 1-800 radiators for, what, $500, $600? Can you charge $1,200 for that radiator? Probably, right? Now, if you're trying to charge huge margins on a $40,000 engine, those guys are probably going to take the time to shop it. But part of it is, you know your customers, you know what you can get by with. These are just some tactics to try to get a little bit of an edge. I mean, I know the market's gotten a lot tighter. So if you can leverage some aftermarket parts to help your percentages, it'll help a lot. So operating overhead. This is a big one that a lot of people don't pay attention to. And the big reason why is they just think these costs are fixed. They can't do anything about it. But a lot of times I dive into books and I find things that shouldn't be there. They don't belong in the books. So an example that goes into your overhead is going to be your rent, your mortgage, your utilities, cost of managers. So anybody who's not a production employee, right? So if you got a part-time kid that comes in and sweeps the floor, he's actually an overhead expense, right? Unless he's hanging parts and you're billing for his time, he's not a production employee. Insurance is a big one that I think a lot of guys don't shop it enough. You know, I go into shops and they've just had the same agent for 20 years and they're paying, they just assume they're getting the right. Insurance is pretty negotiable. And then any other expenses that don't fall into that. Now, a big trap for that, a big trap for these expenses, I see too many P&Ls. And it really hurts you when you start hiding expenses. And what I mean by hiding expenses, repair shops do not need a boat to fix trucks. So if you went out and bought a boat and you expensed it, that's fine. That's perfectly legal. I'm not a tax guy. But I'm telling you, it's got no business in your books. Because the day you try to go get a loan, or 10 years from now you decide that you want to maybe sell it because you're getting older and you want to retire, and someone wants to come in and look at your books, and they find all this stuff, it's going to make it look like you're not making any money. So the big tip I give owners is you need to have a separate column in your P&L. So if you're using QuickBooks, for example, it's going to make a separate column with another company in it, call it discretionary spending, dump all that money in there. I'm not saying you can't go buy a new truck and write it off, totally legal. But unless that truck's getting used every day to go get parts and take drivers to the motel and everything, don't put it in your books. It's got no business there. All you're going to do is make it harder when you need a loan. And that's another piece of advice I give owners too, is don't wait until you need money to go look for it. Banks don't want to loan people that are broke. They want to loan money to people that have money, right? So it's about relationships. Go to the bank when you're doing good and you don't need the money, secure a line of credit. Because you never know what time you're going to have perfect example, one of the biggest mail contractors in the country went bankrupt on us when I owned a shop. And we took us completely out of surprise. And this was even pre-COVID. And that hurt a lot. You know, that was a big hit because it was our number one customer by dollars. And they stuck us with a pretty big bill for a while. So that's an example of where a line of credit can help, you know, smooth that out. So putting all this together, what does that mean? I'm going to back up a couple slides. So what we've talked about is basically all the numbers that go into this. So this is a very, very quick way to diagnose your business. If you pull your numbers and you pull your data and you look at this, it shows you where to dive into to try to figure out, what am I off on? Why are my expenses off? And probably an example of cost of labor is tech efficiency. Most shops don't understand when their cost of labor is so high, they think it's because they got to pay their techs too much. Well, you're right. You might be paying your techs too much not to do anything. But whose fault is it that technicians don't get anything done? I know a lot of owners want to blame the technician and say it's the technician's fault. Really? Where'd you put the jacks? How far has he got to walk to get parts? How far has he got to walk to wash his hands? You want him washing his hands before he moves every truck and gets in and out of them and gets them greasy, right? How far away has he got to go to wash his hands? Every single truck, right? And I know that some of you are stuck with what you have for a facility. You just can't get around it. You know what I told shop owners? Rags in a bucket are really cheap. Just go buy them the hand towels. I know that seems like a huge expense, but you got to figure out what your time's worth. You know, I went into a shop and did a study and actually sat and watched, and I said, you know what? We can save $2,000 a month, actually increase revenue by $2,000 a month, if we just give every mechanic a door clicker. And the owner said, but they lose them. I said, really? It's a $10 door clicker. What's that really cost? But what does it cost you to waste their time? Not to mention the fact they would open the door, walk outside, leave the door open, all the heat went out, right? It already costs enough to heat these buildings, right? You're pulling in a 40,000-pound ice cube. So what are some resources you can do to help yourselves? So a big one that I'm a big proponent of is EOS, which is Entrepreneur Operating System. And what does this do for you? Well, EOS is a really good tool to help you organize your thoughts, to help you figure out, how am I going to run this shop better? And you'll find out too, some of the most successful guys, they're not successful because they have the best techs. They're not the best people at fixing trucks. They're the best people at running a business. And I think a lot of store managers need to learn to change their identity. You're not a mechanic anymore. The day that you left the world you were in and decided to open a shop, you're not a mechanic. You're a business owner. And so this is a tool to help with that. It really helps have very effective meetings. And this book, by the way, any wives in the audience, if you read this book, it might explain your husband's train of thought. Because seriously, there's so many business owners out there that think very similar to each other, that so many people have a hard time relating to their thought process. That's actually what this gets into. Especially if you have a husband and wife combo, where the husband's probably does the back, what I call the back office, or the back shop. He's in the shop and the wife's in the office, right? That's what they refer to as a visionary and a implementer. It really helps that define rules. That's an example of that. I worked with my wife for a while. There was a lot of friction in the shop, and we sat down and defined rules and said, this is my job, this is your job, to stay out of each other's way, right? We refer to me on this decision, we refer to you on that decision, and when something, we'll sit down when we need to. But mostly speaking, it helps streamline that. Another thing is, if you haven't sat down and created a shop operating system, you should think about that. How do you do what you do? You know, you go buy a brand new car, you get an owner's manual. Anybody here have a documented owner's manual how to run your shop? Think about that. Man, I don't want to use a scare tactic, but what happens if something happens to you tomorrow? What happens to your family? Can that shop continue to operate without you? Because if you're the only one that can make that shop run, if you can't, put it this way, you're all here. Think about how many times your phone has rang since you've left. Seriously, count it. That means that business cannot run without you. And the problem with that is, now you become the limiting factor, which means the bottleneck in the system is you, because you're only one human, right? You figured that out a long time ago because you started hiring techs. You can only change so many tires. You can only do so many tune-ups and so many oil changes. But so few business owners think about that from a running the business standpoint. You know, they want to write all the bills and they want to control all the money and they want to do all these things, but they end up becoming the bottleneck in the system. And if you don't have a written plan, it's pretty hard to know where you're at. It's like what I used to say to people all the time. Back to this. If you don't know what good is and you don't know what bad is, how do you know what you have? And if you haven't documented the jobs and the roles in your business, and you haven't shown your employees, this is what we expect from you. You know, I've got a story of that. I had a technician once. It was a young female, really good technician, but she was just young and made a lot of mistakes. I could tell that I was running a very good business the day that she came to me and says, I can't work for you anymore because I can't meet your standards. I didn't have to fire her. She realized through culture in our society, in our business, that she just didn't fit. She wasn't a good match and she couldn't uphold. And I was very respectful to that. It's the same way with pay. You know, you have so many technicians that are leaving. They're leapfrogging to all these stores for $2, $1, $5. What if you had employees that would come to you and sit down and say, this is how much money I need to make? I love those employees because I would slide them the sheet and say, good, this is all you need to do. We literally have a chart. You just need to bill this many hours and you can make 180 grand a year. And you can afford to pay it. I know people are going to say, oh my God, you can't pay a technician 180, thousand a year. What if that guy's billing 500,000 in labor? And there's technicians out there that are doing it. It's possible to do that in a year. So this is another example of something that you should document in your shop. What is your workflow? How do you do what you do? Because I guarantee one thing about this chart, that you can use this to diagnose your business. You could literally take this chart, you could go back tomorrow, sit down in your office, bring a manager, bring a service advisor, bring a parts guy out. When something goes wrong, a part doesn't get ordered, you fix a truck you didn't have authorization to fix, you can go to this chart and say, where did we go wrong? So this is literally a diagnostic chart. But it also, what it does is it helps teach your employees. We have a documented set way of doing things. We're going to do things in order. We're going to do things right. Now this does follow Fullbay, which is a software. Really what this is too, it's about status change, right? The part's been ordered. I know it's been ordered. There's no questions. Did the part get ordered? Well, you know it's got ordered because it's in parts ready to receive status. And anybody that wants this presentation, there's actually going to be a link that you can get the entire thing if you want to go back through it. Is there any questions from anybody? And this is the link, by the way, that'll take you to the page where you can download the entire presentation. Any questions? Okay, well, thanks everyone. Appreciate your time.